Some mornings whisper promises. Others simply unfold. Quiet, routine, unremarkable. And then there are mornings like this one, where the air carries a weight no one can name, and even the softest step echoes like a warning. At Boston Logan International Airport, the sun had just begun to stretch across the runways, casting long golden slants through the terminal's glass-paneled facade. Travelers bustled with purpose, their rolling suitcases clicking along polished floors like distant metronomes. In Terminal B, Gate 17, the morning announcements flowed smoothly from the overhead speakers, slicing through idle chatter and the rhythmic hum of movement. Two figures stood out among the sea of passengers, not because of volume or spectacle, but because of something quieter, a sense of presence. Arielle Bennett, 17, adjusted the cuff of her powder blue blouse and glanced sideways at her younger brother. Malik, 15, stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, the strap of his messenger bag cutting diagonally across his charcoal blazer. Their outfits were simple, elegant, pressed, clean, and intentional. They were not dressed to impress, they were dressed to respect. Today was their great-grandmother's 100th birthday. Not many people could say they had a living relative who had seen both world wars, the civil rights movement, and the digital age. And even fewer could say they were flying first class to deliver her a gift she'd never expect. One passed down through 4 generations of Bennett women, now wrapped carefully in gold silk paper and resting in Arielle's arms like it was breakable, not just in form, but in meaning. The boarding process was calm, even courteous. When Group 1 was called, Arielle and Malik stepped forward side by side, their posture dignified but unassuming. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and tired eyes, took their boarding passes without hesitation. Beep. Beep. The scanner welcomed them aboard, no questions asked. "Enjoy your flight," she offered, a touch of genuine warmth in her tone. "Thank you," Arielle replied softly, tucking her pass into her purse. Malik gave a polite nod as they moved past her. The jet bridge was lined with dim floor lights, like a soft runway of its own, guiding them toward the aircraft. A quiet hush fell over the siblings as they walked. Neither speaking, but they didn't need to. Their silence was a shared one, a language built from growing up in rooms where they were either too noticed or not seen at all. The moment they stepped into the first-class cabin, the air changed, not in temperature, but in texture. The scent of citrus-scented towels and fresh leather seats hovered in the background as smooth jazz trickled from overhead speakers. Passengers were already settling in, briefcases sliding under seats, devices tucked into side pockets, newspapers folded with ritualistic precision. Seat 2A, Seat 2B. Arielle carefully placed the gift box in the compartment beside her seat before lowering herself gracefully into 2A. She slipped off her low heels and adjusted the hem of her skirt. Malik took 2B beside her, glancing out the window as the airport ground crew moved in rehearsed choreography. A flight attendant passed by with folded towels on a silver tray. Everything felt serene, almost suspended in time. Almost, because it didn't take long for the serenity to break. From the front of the cabin, a tall figure moved with deliberate steps, heels clicking rhythmically against the carpet. Claudia Monroe, senior flight attendant, appeared like a character stepping into a scene already in motion, her presence immediately dominating. Her uniform was crisp, severe, her auburn hair pulled so tightly into a bun it looked like it might ache. She stopped beside row 2. Her eyes didn't scan the cabin. They narrowed, immediately fixing on the siblings. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth but lined with frost. "Are you certain these are your seats?" Arielle blinked. "Yes," she replied evenly, lifting her boarding pass for Claudia to see. Malik remained quiet, his hand still in his lap, but his jaw tensed. Claudia took the pass, looked it over, slowly, as if it were written in code. Her fingers tapped it twice before she handed it back without a word. She murmured, lips pursed. "We'll see." Then she turned and walked off. The siblings exchanged a glance. Arielle gave a faint smile, the kind trained in Sunday school and student council meetings, the kind that says, "Be polite, don't escalate, let it pass." Malik looked away, staring at the window again. His silence wasn't passive, It was calculated. Their seats were valid. They had done nothing wrong. And yet there it was, that flicker of something not quite said, not quite official, but unmistakable. You do not belong here. It wasn't the first time, but it always hit the same. 10 minutes passed. Passengers continued boarding. The gentle clatter of carry-ons filled the cabin. Engines hummed beneath the floorboards as the aircraft prepared for departure. But the air, once light, had grown heavier. And Arielle knew, somewhere between Claudia's icy tone and that lingering look, this flight was about to become something more than just a trip to see Grandma. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she knew, and she braced herself. Because not all first-class seats are created equal. Some come with champagne. Others come with a test. The cabin doors sealed with a soft hydraulic hiss, shutting out the noise of the terminal and leaving behind a curated world of calm and control. But for Arielle and Malik Bennett, seated in 2A and 2B, calm was quickly becoming an illusion. Claudia Monroe, the senior flight attendant, returned, this time without the polished veneer of professional courtesy. Her stride was quicker, her jaw tighter, as if the act of returning to the same two seats had drawn something unwelcome to the surface. She stopped directly beside them, arms folded, casting a long shadow over Malik's lap. The murmur of other passengers ebbed slightly as eyes turned in her direction. "I'm going to ask you once more," she said, her voice clipped. "Please gather your belongings and come with me. These seats are no longer available." Arielle lifted her gaze slowly. "No longer available," she echoed. Her voice was soft, steady, not confrontational, but clear. Claudia didn't flinch. "There's been a last-minute reassignment. We need this route for priority passengers." "Priority?" Malik asked, his voice firm but respectful. "We're flying first class. These are our assigned seats." Claudia narrowed her eyes. "And now they're reassigned." Arielle inhaled through her nose, fingers tightening around the edge of her armrest. She looked toward the overhead bin where her box still rested. "With respect," she said calmly, "we're not moving unless the captain himself tells us to." It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. Passengers nearby had begun to take subtle notice. A man in 3A adjusted his glasses and turned his head. A woman across the aisle lowered her magazine, her eyes tracking every word. No one said anything, but the air thickened with attention, as if the cabin itself was listening. Claudia's lips thinned. "If you refuse to comply, I will call airport security," she said coldly. "You are obstructing our procedures." Malik leaned forward slightly, his voice low but unshakable. "We're not obstructing anything. We're seated in the right seats with the right tickets. You are welcome to double-check with the captain." Claudia's posture stiffened. A small tremor of frustration crept up her spine. Passengers murmured now, not loud enough to interrupt, but loud enough to affirm. They heard. They saw. Arielle looked down at her lap. Her fingers were trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. She felt like she had to fight gravity just to sit upright. The humiliation wasn't loud or theatrical. It was slow, tightening around her ribs like invisible rope. Then Claudia did something else. She turned toward the rest of the cabin and, with a dramatic wave of her hand, addressed the situation loud enough for several rows to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we're experiencing a seating issue. Please bear with us while we resolve this disruption." Disruption. That word hung in the air like smoke. Arielle's ears rang. Malik placed a gentle hand on his sister's shoulder. She was still holding it together, but just barely. Her lips pressed tightly, blinking back the heat behind her eyes. Claudia turned sharply and marched toward the front, whispering furiously into her crew radio. Inside Arielle's purse, her phone buzzed once. Then again, a silent reminder. You are not alone. She reached down slowly, opened the zipper, and pulled out her phone. With one hand shielding the screen, she tapped a single contact. Uncle Elliot. She didn't write much. Just a few words. Boarded. Being told to move. Hearsay. No explanation. She hit send. No one needed to know who Elliot Bennett was. Not yet. She slid the phone back into her bag and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Malik exhaled through his nose and resumed pretending to read the airline magazine, though the text swam on the page. He was aware of every eye that flicked toward them, and just as quickly looked away. The quiet judgments, the discomfort, the guilt is not directed at them, but around them. Minutes passed. Then Claudia returned with another flight attendant in tow. The second one, younger, looked visibly nervous. Her name tag read Marissa. Her eyes darted between Claudia and the siblings. She said nothing. Claudia leaned down, once again intruding on Arielle's space. Her breath smelled faintly of mint and steel. "You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be," she whispered. Arielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. The moment was already slipping out of Claudia's control. Claudia turned back to Marissa. "You see these seats?" She snapped, her voice louder now. "They're under my authority." She tapped her name badge like it was a badge of honor. But the sound, click, click, landed hollow in the silence of the cabin. Marissa blinked, then stepped back. Arielle finally spoke. "Why are we being treated like this?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Claudia ignored the question and disappeared again to the front galley. And then, without warning, the cabin intercom crackled. A man's voice, composed and calm, filled the space. "This is your captain speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your continued patience as we attend to a matter involving two of our first-class passengers. I want to be clear. There is no seating conflict, and no one violates any policy. Please remain seated." There it was. The shift. Passengers looked around, startled. Claudia, out of view, was likely frozen in place. Marissa stared at the intercom speaker above their heads like it had just spoken prophecy. Malik smiled faintly. "There it is," he said. Arielle's breath caught for a moment, not from relief, but from validation. Malik leaned closer. "You okay?" She nodded once. "Yes," she whispered. "I am now." From the front of the cabin, Claudia did not return. Instead, Marissa approached the siblings slowly. Her voice, when it came, was gentler. "Would you care for anything to drink?" Arielle met her eyes. There was something new there. Tentative empathy, perhaps. "Just water, thank you," Arielle said. Malik nodded. "Same here." As Marissa turned away, Arielle leaned back in her seat, finally letting herself exhale. But she knew deep down this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. Something about power and how quickly it crumbles when confronted with the quiet truth. The overhead light above seat 2A flickered once, then steadied. Outside the window, the runway shimmered under the morning sun, waiting. But inside the aircraft, time felt suspended, not because of a technical delay, but because of a moral one. The captain's voice had confirmed it. No conflict, no mistake, no reason to move. Arielle and Malik Bennett had done everything right, and yet they'd been treated like they didn't belong. The problem wasn't the boarding pass. The problem was the assumption. A few rows back, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair shifted in her seat. Her name was Miriam Hart. A retired educator, she'd flown this airline for over 25 years. She'd taught generations of children the value of fairness, of standing up without shouting. She had said nothing until now. But as she watched Arielle wipe her palms on her skirt and Malik slowly uncross his arms, she began to speak. Not aloud, but in action. Miriam took out her phone and opened the Notes app. In neat, practiced keystrokes, she began to document everything she had seen. Not for drama, but for the record, for truth. Across the aisle, a young father bent to whisper something to his daughter. The girl, no older than 10, looked wide-eyed at Arielle and Malik, then back at her father. Whatever he said made her nod solemnly and rest her cheek against his shoulder. The ripple effect had begun. Claudia Monroe had not yet reappeared, but her absence spoke louder than her commands ever could. Every second that passed added pressure to a cabin already full of watching eyes and silent judgments. Arielle sat upright, spine straight, fingers gently tapping against her armrest like a metronome of restraint. She was not shaking now. In fact, there was a strange calm in her chest. Not the peace of resolution, but the clarity of control. The kind that comes when you know the truth is on your side. And so is everyone who matters. Marissa, the younger flight attendant, returned with 2 glasses of water. She approached quietly, respectfully, placing them on the tray tables without a word. But her eyes lingered. Then quietly, "I'm sorry," she whispered. Arielle looked up. For what? She asked gently. Marissa swallowed. For how you were treated. For what you're still being made to feel. The moment didn't need fanfare. Arielle simply nodded. Thank you, she said. Malik took a slow sip from his glass, then spoke for the first time in several minutes. I wonder if she's realizing it yet. Arielle raised an eyebrow. Realizing what? That she's lost control. That power doesn't come from the badge on your chest. It comes from how you use it. Arielle gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. People who believe they're untouchable are often the last to feel the ground shift beneath them. Behind them, the soft buzz of phones vibrated like quiet sirens. Word was spreading, first among the passengers, then to the ground crew, and beyond. Up in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds leaned slightly to the left, glancing at the updated flight notes on his screen. A flagged message blinked at the top marked Confidential, Priority Level 1. He read it twice, then turned to his co-pilot. She made the call. His co-pilot, a man in his early 40s with sharp features and a calm demeanor, looked up. You mean? Yes, Reynolds said. Elliot Bennett has been notified. The name landed with weight. Elliot Bennett wasn't just the chairman of Atlas Sky. He was its architect. He'd built the company from a struggling regional line into one of the most respected transcontinental carriers in the world. He was a quiet titan, rarely seen in public, but revered across the industry. And he was, very quietly, the uncle of the two teenagers now seated in row 2. The revelation moved like electricity through the command chain, swift, unseen, and transformative. Within 10 minutes, an urgent message had been relayed back to the cabin crew via secure communication. Claudia Monroe, still sequestered in the rear galley, was instructed to prepare for debriefing upon landing. Effective immediately, her authority as senior cabin supervisor had been revoked pending investigation. The silence that fell upon her was not relief. It was reality setting in. She sat there, hands clasped tightly, heart thudding. Her badge, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a target. Her starched collar scratched against her neck. Her nameplate, Claudia Monroe, senior supervisor, suddenly seemed out of place, as if it no longer belonged to her. She didn't know what the captain had said. She didn't yet know who had made the call, but she knew enough to feel the shift. Back in row 2, Arielle leaned slightly toward Malik. Do you think Grandma will believe this story? Malik smirked. Not unless we bring the footage. She chuckled softly, the first genuine laugh in over an hour. She'll probably scold us for not pulling rank sooner. She'll also say you did the right thing by staying calm. Arielle's eyes glistened. I hope so. They sat together in a hush, sipping water that now tasted less like an apology and more like restoration. Around them, the cabin resumed its quiet rituals, magazines flipping, seat belts adjusting, coats being removed. But something was different. There was no going back to normal. The flight hadn't taken off, but a journey had already begun. One that wasn't measured in miles, but in meaning. Because this was no longer about a seating assignment. This was about a culture, about a question whispered in thousands of cabins, classrooms, and boardrooms across the world. Who do we believe belongs? And in this moment, at 0 feet altitude, in a silver tube on an idle runway, the answer was being rewritten by two teenagers who had said nothing extraordinary. They had only refused to move, and that had been enough to move the world. The aircraft had not yet left the tarmac, but inside its walls, something irreversible had already shifted. Passengers, still buckled in their seats, remained unusually quiet, watching, waiting. There were no updates on takeoff, no announcements about weather or traffic, but everyone knew something was happening, even if they couldn't name it yet. In the rear galley, Claudia Monroe sat rigid on the fold-down jump seat, her back straight, hands locked tightly in her lap. The calmness she used to wield like a blade was now nowhere to be found. Instead, silence pressed against her like gravity. A message had arrived, not from her manager, not from ground control, but from corporate affairs, the kind of message that made your hands go cold. Immediate suspension pending investigation. Do not approach passengers. Remain in the aft jump seat until further instruction. The authority she'd spent 12 years cultivating had been revoked, quietly, efficiently, and without appeal. And all because she had chosen to question, confront, and humiliate two teenagers who had done absolutely nothing wrong. She could still see them in her mind, the girl's quiet dignity, the boy's unwavering composure. Why didn't I just let them be? But it was too late for regrets now. The spotlight was no longer on her. It had swung away and caught her shadow instead, magnifying it for the entire aircraft to see. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds' face was unreadable. He had spoken to Arielle Bennett directly. Brief, factual, respectful. There had been no raised voices, no threats, just one chilling line. My niece and nephew will not be moved. And when this flight lands, I want a full report. Witness accounts, timestamps, everything. Not just for HR, for me. It was not the tone of a man demanding special treatment. It was the tone of a man watching a house he'd built show cracks in its foundation and preparing to rebuild it brick by brick, starting with accountability. Captain Reynolds exhaled and turned to his co-pilot. We hold for 15 more minutes, no movement until clearance. The co-pilot nodded but said nothing. The tension in the air didn't need commentary. Back in row 2, Arielle watched the glass of water on her tray table ripple slightly from the vibration of the idle engines. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't angry either. She was present. For years, she'd been taught to speak up when necessary, but also to pick her battles. Choose dignity over spectacle. Choose patience over fury. But today had taught her something new, that sometimes simply refusing to move was the act of revolution. Malik, seated beside her, tapped gently at his phone. A single message from their uncle blinked on the screen. Hold steady. I'm watching from here. E. He turned the phone to show Arielle. She smiled faintly and nodded. That was all they needed. Elsewhere in the cabin, whispers continued, now edged with certainty. She's been suspended mid-flight? A businessman muttered under his breath to the woman beside him. I think so, she replied. I saw the younger flight attendant bring her phone to the cockpit. Something changed after that. Passengers weren't just passengers now. They were witnesses to something rare, something honest. And in first class, respect had shifted its gaze toward row 2. 20 minutes later, Claudia was summoned. The call came via headset from the first officer. A short, direct instruction. Please proceed to the forward galley with your crew badge and personal items. Her pulse surged. As she rose from the jump seat, she felt the stares. They weren't angry. They weren't gloating. They were watchful, like the quiet stare of history taking notes. She smoothed her skirt, lifted her chin, and walked the aisle. But it no longer belonged to her. Each step clicked hollowly against the carpet. The distance from row 24 to row 2 had never felt so long. Her shoes, once symbols of polish and authority, now felt like heavy echoes of misjudgment. When she reached row 2, she paused. Arielle didn't look up. Neither did Malik. Their silence was louder than any rebuke. Claudia hesitated. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain that she didn't mean it like that. But intention was not the issue. The impact was. And this wasn't her moment anymore. She moved on, slipping into the front galley where Marissa stood waiting, eyes lowered, arms folded neatly. A small envelope sat on the metal prep surface. Inside was a form, her official suspension notice prepared mid-flight under directive from corporate HR. Claudia stared at it for a moment. Then, without a word, she reached up, unclipped her name badge, and placed it gently beside the envelope. She had once fought for that badge. Now it felt like plastic, meaningless in the face of a single assumption that had unraveled everything. Back in row 2, Arielle leaned toward her brother. Did you notice something? She asked. Malik looked up. What? No one cheered, no applause, no outrage. Malik smiled faintly. Respect doesn't always arrive with noise. And he was right. It arrives in the pause. The moment of stillness when people recognize injustice, not just as something that happens, but something they can choose not to allow. By the time the captain announced they were preparing for takeoff, the energy in the cabin had shifted entirely. Not lighter, not celebratory, but real. As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the open sky, Arielle leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. She wasn't tired. She was ready, because the seat she occupied was no longer just a seat, it was a statement. At 31,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft ambient glow. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, deep blue fading into the faintest gray as the aircraft cut across time zones. Yet inside the plane, no one was thinking about altitude. The real turbulence had already passed, and it hadn't come from the weather. It had come from within. The in-flight service had resumed as scheduled, drinks poured, trays distributed, the usual prelude to mid-flight comfort. But everything tasted a little different now, not because of the food, because of the silence that had settled. Not oppressive, not awkward, reflective. Across the cabin, passengers wore the same expressions seen in the quiet aftermath of a courtroom verdict. They weren't sure what they'd witnessed exactly. An incident? A confrontation? A reckoning? But they knew it had mattered, and that they had been part of it simply by seeing. Row 2 had become the eye of that storm. Arielle sat upright, napkin resting in her lap, her fingers idly folding its edges. Malik beside her held a tablet in his hands but hadn't turned it on. Neither said much. Words felt unnecessary. Both knew what had happened, and more importantly, what it meant. "Miss Bennett," a soft voice interrupted. It was Marissa. Her posture was more relaxed now, but her eyes still carried the hesitance of someone walking a line between duty and conscience. "Yes?" Arielle asked gently. Marissa lowered her voice. "The captain asked me to let you know. Mr. Bennett has requested a formal review panel when we land. Your uncle, I mean." Arielle nodded once. "Thank you. I I just wanted to say again," Marissa hesitated. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." "We know," Malik said, his tone calm but resolute. "But we're not surprised." Marissa's face flushed slightly, and she stepped away without another word. Her silence wasn't dismissal. It was understanding. A few rows back, Miriam Hart, who had quietly observed everything, finally turned on her phone's airplane mode and began drafting an email. She didn't know if she'd send it to the airline or a national publication, but it needed to be written. Truth had a way of needing to be recorded before it faded into polite forgetfulness. Meanwhile, in the cabin crew's secure communication channel, the directive from corporate had escalated. What began as a suspension had now turned into something else. A leak. Someone at headquarters had tipped off a reporter, one of those rare, well-sourced journalists who didn't chase sensationalism, but justice. The story was simple, elegant, and damning. 2 black teens humiliated in first class. Flight attendant suspended midair. Airline responds with swift accountability. The headline appeared quietly at first, buried in a travel blog's live update feed, but within 30 minutes it had spread to 2 news apps and Twitter. A 6-second video, shot by a passenger in seat 3C, showed Claudia Monroe towering over Arielle and Malik, her finger pointing, her tone unreadable, but her posture undeniable. By the time the plane crossed into Illinois airspace, the clip had already amassed over 120,000 views. Back on the plane, Claudia sat silently in the rear, no longer part of the service rotation. She had removed her heels, now tucked beneath her seat. Her uniform blouse clung uncomfortably to her back. The envelope from earlier rested unopened in her lap. Her name badge, once a symbol of pride, was gone. She stared ahead at nothing. She could hear them whispering behind her. She had once walked this aisle like she owned it. Now she barely occupied space. She had reviewed the incident over and over in her mind. She could have simply greeted them, confirmed their tickets, and walked away. But no, she had let something uglier guide her instinct, something unspoken but deeply rooted. She hadn't questioned the elderly couple in 1A and 1B. She hadn't stared at the white college student in 3D when he boarded with jeans and a hoodie. But Arielle's calm voice, Malik's pressed blazer, their quiet confidence that had disturbed her more than it should have. Now she was the one disturbed and disarmed. Up front, the captain's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly into Chicago O'Hare. The weather is calm. On behalf of the crew, thank you for your patience." The usual script. But this time, it landed differently. A few passengers glanced toward row 2 again, not with pity, but with respect. A mother seated in 4C leaned toward her child and whispered, "Remember their grace. That's how you hold power. The child nodded quietly, eyes lingering on Arielle. As the landing gear lowered, Arielle leaned toward her brother. "Do you feel it?" she asked. Malik turned. "What?" "The air. It's heavier when truth starts taking shape." He smiled. "That, or it's just Chicago." Arielle gave a breath of laughter and shook her head. "Maybe both." The flight touched down smoothly. Applause didn't erupt. This wasn't that kind of moment. But the silence that followed was meaningful, like the moment after a judge's gavel. A pause that wasn't empty, but full of knowing. The plane taxied toward its gate. Back in the terminal, Elliot Bennett stood behind a wall of glass, hands clasped behind his back, watching the plane roll into view. His suit was immaculately tailored, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes there was fire. He wasn't just here as a relative. He was here as a reckoning. As the plane came to a stop at Gate 19, a strange hush overtook the cabin. There was no collective exhale, no impatient rustling of seatbelts. Just a silence filled with anticipation. Like everyone knew this wasn't the end of a flight, but the beginning of a reckoning. The ding of the seatbelt sign turning off felt ceremonial. But no one moved. Arielle remained seated, her fingers folded neatly in her lap. Malik glanced at her, then toward the front of the cabin where the door remained sealed. Something was happening on the other side. They both sensed it. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate, of dress shoes striking the metal of the jet bridge. A figure approached, and when the cabin door opened, he stepped through. Elliot Bennett. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He didn't need one. Dressed in a navy wool suit and open-collared white shirt, he carried himself like someone born into boardrooms but built from something tougher. Someone who knew how to smile gently and fire someone in the same breath. His eyes scanned the cabin, not for chaos, not for drama, but for truth. And he saw it immediately in row 2. Arielle's face softened. "Uncle Elliot," she said under her breath. He offered no public embrace, no theatrics. He simply gave her a nod that said, "You did right." Then turning to the crew, Elliot spoke with a calmness that cut sharper than any yell. "I'd like to speak to Claudia Monroe. Now." Passengers stiffened in their seats, heads turned like clockwork. From the rear galley, the curtain fluttered. Claudia stepped forward hesitantly, her uniform rumpled, her eyes hollow. She had heard that voice only once before, in a video on leadership sent to all Atlas Sky employees. She never imagined she'd hear it directed at her. She walked the aisle slowly, each step a confession. Elliot didn't flinch. When she reached him, she stopped, lips parting to speak, but he raised a hand. "No statements, Miss Monroe. Just accountability." He turned to the captain and the flight supervisor, standing discreetly behind him. "Is the documentation ready?" "Yes, sir." A slim folder was handed to Claudia. Inside, her formal suspension notice, witness statements, and a temporary revocation of her crew credentials. She stared at the contents without reading. Elliot continued, "You will be escorted off this aircraft by airport security. You are not to engage with passengers. You will not reboard another Atlas flight until the Ethics Committee concludes its investigation. Do you understand?" Claudia nodded. "Yes, sir." A guard approached, gentle but firm. Claudia turned to the cabin. Her gaze flicked to Arielle and Malik, but they didn't look back. She wanted to explain, to say, "I didn't know who you were." But it didn't matter, because it had never been about who they were. It had been about what she assumed they were not. And that was the real sin. Passengers sat frozen as Claudia walked the aisle for the final time. Not as a steward of service, but as a symbol of fallen authority. Some averted their eyes, others didn't. She passed row 2. Malik didn't blink. Arielle remained serene. At the front of the cabin, Claudia was met with one final act of consequence. Elliot reached into his pocket and retrieved her badge, handing it to the flight supervisor with a single phrase, "Strip the name. Keep the lesson." Then, without waiting, he turned to his niece and nephew. "You ready?" he asked quietly. They stood together. Malik took the gold-wrapped gift box from the overhead bin. Arielle adjusted her blazer, and the three of them exited, not with pride but with dignity. Outside the gate, reporters had already gathered behind barricades. The leaked video had gone viral. In just 3 hours, hashtags like Wander Row 2 and We Belong in First had trended nationwide. Headlines were multiplying by the minute. Teen siblings targeted on Atlas flight, airline CEO steps in midair. Dignity in seat 2A. Silence speaks loudest. First class, second class treatment. Security cleared a quiet path to the waiting lounge, where a temporary press team had been assembled. Elliot signaled the head of PR, but declined to give a live statement. "Let the world absorb the footage first," he said. "They'll understand more from that than from anything I can say." In the quiet lounge, Arielle and Malik finally sat again. The gold gift box rested between them, now a symbol of something much larger than a birthday. Arielle looked down at her phone. Dozens of messages lit up the screen. Friends, classmates, teachers, some she hadn't spoken to in months. One simply read, "I saw what happened. You're changing things. Thank you." She handed the phone to Malik. He scrolled, then exhaled deeply. "This is wild," he murmured. "Is it?" Arielle replied. "Or is it overdue?" Malik leaned back and closed his eyes. "Maybe both." Later that evening, in a statement released across major networks, Elliot Bennett addressed the situation directly. "Today, 2 passengers on our aircraft were subjected to disrespect that had no place in our airline, nor any corner of our society. Let me be clear, this wasn't about protocol. This was about perception and the harm it can cause when left unchecked. Dignity is not awarded by wealth, skin color, or seating class. It is the minimum every human being deserves. And from this day forward, Atlas Sky will ensure that minimum is never compromised again." By sunrise the next day, what had begun as a quiet moment of injustice inside a sealed airplane cabin had exploded across the national consciousness. The video, just 6 seconds long, was now featured on every major news outlet. It showed Arielle sitting calmly, eyes steady, while Claudia Monroe pointed and loomed. It captured Malik's composed defiance, the way his eyes never left his sister's face, as if reminding her, "We stand, even while seated." And it captured something else too, the silence, the poised refusal to yield. No yelling, no dramatics, just stillness against a wave. And somehow it said everything. By 8:01 a.m., hashtags were flooding every platform. Jean Row 2, a tribute to the sibling seat. We Belong in First, a rallying cry turned movement. Turned quiet dignity, a phrase that kept appearing in opinion pieces, blog titles, and hand-lettered protest signs outside Atlas Sky offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. News anchors debated the ethics of in-flight conduct. Activists shared personal stories of being mistaken for someone who didn't belong. Students wrote think pieces. Parents showed their children the clip. In living rooms, barber shops, classrooms, and boardrooms, one conversation echoed, "What does it take to be seen as worthy of a seat?" In a small apartment in Atlanta, a retired flight attendant named Linda James watched the footage with tears in her eyes. She had seen versions of this story unfold before. Muted, dismissed, rewritten. But this time, it was different. This time, there was proof. There was clarity. There was action, and there were names. Arielle and Malik Bennett. At 9:12 a.m., an email landed in Arielle's inbox with the subject line, "Good morning from CBS Morning News. Invitation to speak." By noon, there were 8 more: CNN, MSNBC, The Atlantic, Teen Vogue, NPR, and even an invitation from Harvard Kennedy School for an upcoming civil discourse panel. Malik raised an eyebrow when he saw the last one. "Didn't think seat 2B would take me to Harvard," he joked. Arielle gave him a look. "Stay humble," he shrugged. "You know I will. Just shocked." She nodded. "Me too." Meanwhile, Claudia Monroe's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. A video of her being escorted down the jet bridge, expression blank, had surfaced. She was no longer anonymous. Internet sleuths had unearthed past complaints filed against her, some buried, others quietly settled. A former crew member tweeted, "Claudia always had a problem with passengers who didn't look the part. We were trained to de-escalate, but she believed in asserting control, no matter the cost." The quote went viral. At Atlas Sky headquarters, Elliot Bennett convened an emergency board meeting. No corporate language, he told his PR team. No regret the incident. This isn't about optics. This is about culture. He tapped a folder on the desk titled Project Row 2. This is going to be more than damage control, he said. This is going to be a reform, visible, enforceable, and passenger-driven. Inside the folder, a plan for bias recognition training across all flight crews, a passenger-led oversight board, a scholarship fund named after Arielle and Malik's great-grandmother, whom they had been traveling to honor. She lived through Jim Crow. Now her name will live in first-class cabins around the world. Back at the Bennett household, the family sat quietly around the breakfast table. Pancakes sat untouched. The air was thick with questions no one quite knew how to ask. Their mother, Celeste, finally spoke. "Are you two okay?" Arielle nodded. "Better than yesterday," Malik added. "Still processing." Their grandmother, Gloria, reached across the table and placed her hand over theirs. "I watched the clip," she said, "and I saw not just strength, but grace, the kind that changes hearts." She paused, then added softly, "Don't let the world make you angry, babies. Let it make you sharper, kinder, clearer." They both nodded. That evening, Arielle sat alone in her room scrolling through messages. One in particular stopped her. "I've never seen myself in first class. Not until I saw you there. Thank you. Dr. Laney, cardiologist, California." She stared at it, fingers hovering above the screen. Then she picked up her phone and typed a reply. "We didn't go looking for this moment, but we won't run from it either." She pressed send, then whispered to herself, "It's not about the seat. It never was." Outside, the city hummed. Inside, her phone buzzed again. Elliot had texted both siblings. "Tomorrow, I'd like you to join me at the press conference. You don't need to speak unless you want to, but you deserve to be seen." Malik looked at his sister. "What do you think?" Arielle didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window, watching the sky deepen into dusk. Then she said, "I think we didn't ask for a microphone, but maybe the world needs to hear what quiet sounds like." The lights in the Atlas Sky Auditorium were blinding. Rows of stage bulbs humming overhead, camera lenses blinking like digital fireflies. The podium stood center stage, flanked by two chairs that looked more like symbols than seats. A soft white banner hung behind it, with a single phrase printed in navy. "We all belong in row 2." It was the first time Arielle and Malik had stood before the public, not as students, not as passengers, but as witnesses, as voices, whether or not they chose to speak. Elliot Bennett approached the podium first, dressed in the same calm navy suit he had worn on the jet bridge, but now with a look sharpened by resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for being here, not just as press, but as participants in what must be a cultural shift." A pause, the cameras clicked, the silence thickened. "Let me begin by saying this clearly. Atlas Sky failed. We failed two passengers who did everything right. We failed to recognize a rot that had been growing unchecked, and we failed to ensure our values were reflected not just in policy, but in practice." Arielle watched from stage left, sitting beside Malik. Her hands were folded, her posture graceful. Malik sat slightly slouched but focused, his knee bouncing, a nervous habit he rarely showed in public. Elliot continued, "What happened on Flight 227 wasn't about protocol. It was about perception. It was about the danger of unchecked bias in high-altitude spaces. And it was about the strength of two young people who chose stillness over outrage and still changed everything." He turned then. "To my niece and nephew, Arielle and Malik Bennett, I want to say personally and publicly, thank you. Not just for your courage, but for your clarity. You reminded us that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard." He gestured softly. "If you'd like to say something, the floor is yours. But know this, your presence alone speaks volumes." Arielle stood first. Her heels didn't click. They whispered. She stepped to the podium, took a breath, and looked at the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was steady as glass. "I'm not here today because I want attention," she began. "I'm here because for a long time, people like me have been told to sit quietly and not make things harder for others." A pause. "I did sit quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cause a scene. But someone decided I didn't belong. Not because of what I did, but because of how I look. And that's what made this harder for everyone. Her gaze swept the room. We were traveling to honor our great-grandmother, a woman who was denied seats at counters, seats on buses, and a seat at the table. She survived those indignities so we wouldn't have to. Malik stood beside her now. And yet, she continued, there we were, on a plane in 2025, fighting for a seat we had already earned. Her voice didn't crack. It rose. We didn't ask for a movement, but the moment asked something of us, and we answered. Not with fists, not with fury, but with presence. She stepped back, and for a long moment, the auditorium said nothing. Then, an older black woman near the front, dressed in a deep green suit and pearls, stood. She placed her hand on her chest. Her eyes glistened. She whispered, "Thank you." It was enough to break the silence. Applause spread slowly, like a sunrise through the room. Not thunderous, not performative, just real, human, earned. In the hours that followed, Arielle and Malik's remarks were replayed on every network. Opinion pieces hailed their composure. High schools played the clip during civics classes. A university in Michigan announced a full tuition scholarship named the Quiet Courage Award. But not everything was applause. Some headlines challenged their motivations. Online trolls tried to frame the moment as overblown. Others suggested their uncle's power was the real reason anything had changed. Arielle saw it all. She read every word. And then she closed the screen. She turned to Malik that evening, sitting by the window as the sun dipped behind the skyline. "Let them talk," she said. Malik didn't look up. "They will," she smiled faintly. "But we didn't act to be liked. We acted to be seen." And for the first time in their lives, the world had no choice but to look. A week had passed since the press conference. A week since two teenagers stepped onto a stage and shook the conscience of a country, not with outrage, but with restraint. And yet the aftershocks of their stand continued to ripple outward, far beyond the seats of row 2. Across the aviation industry, boardrooms buzzed with urgency. Public relations teams scrambled. Internal emails leaked. And slowly, publicly, change began to stir. It started with a headline. Sky Global Airlines commits to dignity initiative after Atlas incident. Sky Global, Atlas's largest competitor, announced a sweeping reform plan, new anti-bias protocols, passenger ombudsman roles on select flights, and an unprecedented move. Dedicated equity liaisons on all international routes. The media hailed it as a bold step, but behind closed doors, the motivation was clear. Atlas had set a new standard, and no one wanted to be next in line for exposure. At Atlas Sky headquarters, Arielle Bennett reviewed updates with his executive team. His office was still, his presence steady as always, but his tone had sharpened. "Everyone's watching us now," he said, "and they should. We've opened the curtain. We either follow through or we become the next headline." He tapped the edge of a folder labeled Flight 227, Internal Ethics Brief. Inside were not just policies, but testimonies, dozens of them from passengers, crew, even former Atlas employees. They revealed something sobering. Claudia Monroe was not an anomaly. She was a symptom. Arielle had been right. This wasn't about a seat. It was about what the seat represented and how often it had been quietly, systematically denied. Elsewhere, Claudia Monroe sat in the back corner of a small press interview room. The once proud senior flight attendant now wore plain clothes, her hair pulled back, her badge long surrendered. A single reporter sat across from her, Vivian Shea, known for conducting interviews that cut gently but deeply. The room was quiet. Vivian started her recorder. "Claudia, thank you for agreeing to speak." Claudia's voice was raspy. "I didn't come to defend myself. I came to reckon with it." Vivian nodded. "Then let's begin there. Why did you stop them?" Claudia looked down, her hands clenched. "I saw two kids in first class," she said softly, "and instead of seeing them as passengers, I saw a question." "A question?" Claudia's throat tightened. "Of whether they belonged." She let out a shaky breath. "I didn't realize how much that question lived in me, how automatic it had become." Vivian leaned forward. "What would you say to Arielle and Malik now?" Claudia's voice cracked. "I'm sorry, not just for the way I treated them, but for the weight I added to a burden they already carried. The interview aired that night. Some said it was performative. Others said it was overdue. But most agreed on one thing. Accountability, however late, still matters. Arielle watched the interview with her mother, her face unreadable. Malik sat on the floor beside her, arms folded. When it ended, their mother turned to them. "Well?" she asked. Arielle didn't speak right away. "Then, it's a start," Malik added, "but not the end." Later that night, Arielle received a text from a stranger. "I'm a gate agent. I used to think I was neutral, but I saw myself in that clip, and it scared me. Thank you for waking us up." She read it twice, then turned off her phone. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the window. A city was falling asleep, but somewhere inside it, people were waking up. The next morning, a commemorative banner was unveiled at O'Hare International Airport, just above Gate 19, where Flight 227 had landed. It read, "Let every seat be a place of dignity," and beneath it, a quote, "We didn't ask for a movement. The moment asked for us." AB travelers paused beneath it, some to snap photos, others just to reflect. It was simple, but it was seen. Meanwhile, Arielle Bennett finalized a partnership with several civil rights organizations to create a multi-airline equity in flight council. Their mission, ongoing audits, passenger reports, and a framework to hold airline staff accountable in real time. And at the heart of the council, two honorary advisors, Arielle and Malik Bennett. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the siblings visited their great-grandmother at her home. She opened the gold-wrapped box they had brought on Flight 227, untouched until now. Inside was a framed photo of her in 1963, standing outside a diner that had refused to seat her. Beside it, a photo of Arielle and Malik seated in first class, silent and unwavering. Tears filled her eyes. "You brought me more than a gift," she said. "You brought me full circle." It was a crisp November morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the busiest terminal in the country, and on this day, the quietest. Gate A4 had been transformed, not with balloons or banners, but with something more solemn, more deliberate. Rows of seats faced a small stage draped in white linen. At its center stood a podium, and just behind it, two first-class airline seats mounted on a raised platform, replicas of 2EA and 2B from Flight 227. Embroidered on the headrest were simple words in gold thread, "For those who did not move." Arielle and Malik Bennett stood off stage, waiting. The moment was not about ceremony. It was about closure and continuation. Arielle Bennett approached the microphone first, his presence as steady as ever. "Good morning," he said. "Today, we are not just launching a new policy. We are launching a new posture for this company, and we hope, for this industry." Behind him, the crowd of executives, press, crew members, and travelers leaned in. "It is our honor to announce the official beginning of Equity in Flight, a nationwide training, accountability, and advocacy program developed with guidance from civil rights leaders, ethics scholars, and most importantly, passengers." He gestured to the replica seats behind him. "These two chairs have traveled farther than most flights ever will. They represent a simple truth, that respect cannot be assumed. It must be extended." Then his voice softened. "Before we continue, I would like to invite two people to this stage, not because they sought it, but because they earned it." He stepped aside. The room fell still. Arielle and Malik walked together, slowly. Not grandly, just present. Arielle took the podium. Her voice, low, measured, felt like the hush before a choir begins. "We never wanted to become symbols," she said. "We were just traveling to honor our grandmother. But somewhere along the journey, we were asked a question." She looked up, not by words but by looks, by silence. The question was, "Do you belong here?" And our answer was also silence, but it was clear. She turned to Malik. He stepped forward. "I used to think justice looked loud, like shouting in the streets, and sometimes it does. But other times, justice looks like staying seated. It looks like holding your ground when everything around you is trying to erase it." A pause. "We were lucky," he added. "We had a voice behind us. Our uncle, the passengers who spoke up, the video that went viral." But there are thousands who don't get seen, whose dignity is questioned in silence, who gets moved, dismissed, forgotten. Arielle closed her eyes for a second, then looked out across the room. This initiative isn't for us, she said. It's for them. The room was quiet, and then a ripple of applause. Not thunderous, not choreographed, just honest. From the gate staff in the back row, from the crew in uniform, from a mother holding her child on her lap, a standing ovation, not for heroism, but for humanity. Later that day, the first equity in flight placards were installed above seat rows on select aircraft. Not branded, not flashy, just a line of quiet words. Dignity lives here. Back at home, Arielle and Malik sat together in their grandmother's garden, watching golden leaves fall around her feet. She sipped sweet tea, her hands gently folded over the gift box that had made the journey from Boston to Chicago and back. "You know what I love most?" she said, smiling. "What's that?" Malik asked. "You didn't shout. You didn't throw fists." She looked at Arielle. "You just stayed seated." Arielle's eyes welled. "Sometimes that's the loudest thing you can do." Elsewhere, on social media, on television, in quiet conversations between strangers, the story lived on. Not as a trend, not as clickbait, but as a reminder that change doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives in a still moment. Two teenagers, two seats, one line they refused to cross, and in airports across the country, passengers began to notice it. Not a logo, not a campaign, just a quiet plaque near row 2, a seat left empty, and a small inscription: "To those who once sat here with dignity and never stood down." In a society that often equates power with volume, where the loudest voices are mistaken for the most courageous, this story reminds us that dignity doesn't always raise its voice. Arielle and Malik Bennett taught us something both simple and profound. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to fight to be seen. Sometimes the most powerful resistance comes not from confrontation, but from calm, unwavering presence. Their decision to remain seated in the face of humiliation was not about defiance for attention. It was a quiet affirmation of self-worth, a declaration that said, without saying a word, "We belong, we have earned our place, and we will not move." In doing so, they held up a mirror to an entire industry and to the assumptions many of us carry without question. They revealed how bias often hides in procedure, how dignity is too often distributed according to appearance, and how systems built on silence can be shaken by a single act of grace. This story isn't just about an airline. It's about every space where worth is questioned and every person who has ever been asked, directly or subtly, to prove they deserve to be where they are. The lesson is this: true strength is not always loud. Justice does not always arrive with protest signs. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to stay in your seat, because the world only changes when people stop moving aside for injustice, cease, and start sitting firmly in their truth.